So the defining characters, if we're looking at people, in that middle section would probably someone like Bir Maruf, who was in Bradford, Bir Imdad Hussain Birzada, who is the principal and founder of Jami al-Karam, the very, very large scale seminary, Barelvi Seminary, the biggest in Britain actually, Bir Munawwar Shah in Birmingham. So these were people who were kind of from Pakistan, actually. All three of them are from Pakistan originally, and then who've come over in that sort of middle period that as we're discussing. Then the people who are coming are Sheikh Nur Hamim Keller, for example, who is a convert but now lives in Jordan. You get people like Sheikh Nazim al-Haqqani, who's a Naqshbandi from Cyprus, a Cypriot sheikh. Slightly later, you get Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, Sheikh Muhammad al-Ninawi, Syrians, both of them. Right. And what you see then is they offer almost an antidote to that Quran and Sunnah rhetoric that we're hearing from the Salafis or Ahl al-Hadith, right? And they're saying, no, the Sufi tradition is also from the Quran and Sunnah.
Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Markfield Institute podcast. I'm delighted to say that I have with me today Dr. Hafsa Iqbal. Dr. Hafsa Iqbal is the course leader for the Islam and Pastoral Care program here at the Markfield Institute. She completed her PhD at Coventry University in Islamic Practical Theology, and she did a master's at the University of Birmingham, and she's also done and studied in South Africa, where she did her BA and also traditionally. Thank you for being here, Dr. Hafsa.
Thank you so much.
So Hafsa, could you tell us a little bit about Sufism in Britain and give us a bit of an overview about Sufism?
Sure. So most people associate the inception of Sufism in Britain with the kind of post-1960s migration from South Asia, which was predominantly brought over by South Asian men who had come to Britain as economic migrants, but had brought with them their kind of spiritualist tradition, so mostly belonging to the kind of Barelvi school. But actually, there's an interesting period in the Victorian period, so the late 1900s and early 20th century, where particularly in the interwar period, there were pockets of Sufi communities. So there's one by a Sufi preacher from India called Inayat Khan, who now really is associated with kind of perennialist Sufism, so not sort of Sunni normative Sufism, if you will. But there was also Sheikh Ali al-Hakimi, who was a Yemeni Sufi scholar, essentially. And both of those people in the interwar period, they did establish Sufi communities around them. So if we move away from Inayat Khan, because he sort of philosophically resonates less with the Sufism of Britain today, because he was more universalist and perennialist, if you will, in his philosophy. But Sheikh Ali Hakimi, for example, established zawiyas, or sort of Sufi lodges, if you will, in the traditional sort of North African style of his own sheikh, who was Algeria, Morocco, that kind of area, in port cities. So where there were Yemeni and Somali sailors, for example, in places like Cardiff and Liverpool, who travelled and had ended up settling in Britain, he actually established Sufi zawiyas to serve them as a community, because there were no built masajid at that point, so no mosques really at that point in time. They then went on to stay in Britain, which many immigrants in the 20th century particularly don't really think they're going to do, and a lot of them married sort of English women who then converted to Islam. And they did, as I say, establish these communities around the Sufi sheikh. And many of them, the spaces that they used and the community that, they're still there, really, not in the established way that they were in the past. But yeah, certainly that was probably on a bigger scale. And I say bigger sort of relatively, because they were relatively small still. That was probably the first time that Sufism really had an establishment in Britain. Then, as I mentioned first, there was the sort of 1960s and thereafter migration of socioeconomic migrants from mostly South Asia, who came and established kind of what we now refer to as kind of the Barelvi tradition. establishing mosques from the 1980s, which had a serious tie to Sufism. And then in the sort of late 90s and early 2000s, so to the turn of the 21st century, we have the influx of kind of non-South Asian Sufi sheikhs, mostly Arabs, some converts, names that you'll know, kind of Hamza Yusuf, Sheikh Nur Hamim Keller, for example, who came and preached to the children, the now British-born children of those migrants who came in the 60s, who again had those ties to the Sufi tradition. And that was really quite pivotal, and it still kind of, it still defines the landscape of British Sufism, if you will, because those murideen, those people who went into the Sufi tradition of Tariqa and Bay'ah with those Sufi sheikhs that I've mentioned, still have big influence and communities here, and they continue to evolve and develop. So there, I would say kind of three significant, on different scales certainly, but three significant periods of inception of Sufism in Britain.
Okay, thank you, Hafsa. So you mentioned this Brelvi school. I think that was the second stage.
Yeah.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the Brelvi movement?
Yeah, so now in the social sciences, we refer to it as kind of Brelviism, if you will, or the Brelvi tradition. But essentially, Brelviism was a revivalist movement, if you will, that was sort of begun or based on the tradition of, so just Sunni normativity, really, and the preservation of Sunni normativity by a scholar of Uttar Pradesh in India in the colonial period, Imam Ahmed Rida Khan. And essentially what Khan did was write a lot of fatwa and create kind of conversations around kind of what he considered to be the decentralization of the Prophet and the rank of Muhammad, essentially, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So essentially what he was calling against was kind of theological diversions from what he considered Sunni Islam.
Could you give some examples?
Yeah, so for his kind of theological kind of adversary, for lack of better words, was the Deobandi school, which was again similarly in that similar 1900s period in India, in colonial India. And what he considered to be the problem was that the Deobandi school and the Wahhabi school, but also Shia Islam and Ahl al-Hadith, all of those sort of slightly different and varying movements, he essentially said, and we can go into the minutiae of it, but just as an overview, that what these schools are doing is deviating from Sunni Islam. And he kind of defined Sunni Islam in this moment in history as those who adhered to the Ash'ari or Maturidi schools of creed, of theology, with a capital T, if you will, who adhered to the four traditional Sunni madahib or schools of jurisprudence. He himself was a Hanafi, for example, and who had, at very least, a reverence for spiritual authority, as is kind of depicted in the Tariqa tradition, or actual initiation into one of the Turuq. So in South Asia at that point, or India, it would have been either the Chistis, the Qadiris, or the Naqshbandis, but he really was just adherence to spiritual authority was his thing, as defined in the Tariqa tradition. And then more than that, he said, and really it was through his articulation of the writings, actually of Ibn Arabi, so he was very inspired by Ibn Arabi and his real kind of, again, centralization of the rank and person of Muhammad as being the ultimate definer, really, of Sunni Islam. You have to have, as he understood it, complete and utter reverence for the person and rank of the Prophet, the final Prophet, sallallahu and without that, you are deviating from that Sunni Islam as he kind of categorized it, if you will, or conceptualized it rather. And so the Brelvi school really is defined by that ethos first and foremost, and then very, very defined by ritual practice and devotion to Muhammad. So things like Naat Khani, or that's the singing of devotional poetry to Muhammad. So in the Arab world, it might be called Inshad, or the singing of Qasaid, for example. But similarly, this is kind of usually Persian, Urdu, perhaps Punjabi language poetry. sung in devotion to the Prophet, the celebration of the prophetic birth, so Mawlid, Mawlud, Milad, as it would have been called in South Asia at that time, and still in the diasporic communities, and then the visiting of shrines, for example, of what are considered kind of awliya. Again, all speaking directly to this acceptance of spiritual authority, first and foremost of the Prophet Muhammad, and then of those who are considered kind of inheritors of him, or the awliya Allah. So very culturally laden. The Barelvi school is defined particularly in its diasporic communities, and there's a huge community in Britain, in the United States, in Europe more widely. They're really defined actually by the latter that I've spoken about, not so much about the Hanafi jurisprudential side or the Maturi Aqidah side, but really about their ritual devotion. Because Khan really was speaking to the lay people of South Asia. These practices of Nadkhani, of Milad, of Khatam, etc., which have become characteristic of the Barelvi school, really were the ritual practices of lay people and rural people. And lots of scholars in the field and contemporary West have talked about kind of folk Islam, Barelviism as folk Islam. But I would argue that Khan really was trying to preserve spirituality of lay people as opposed to the scholarly elite, like the Deobandi counterparts.
What would be the distinction then, between quote unquote folk, religion or Sufism versus a non-folk? What would that look like?
Well, a lot of it's socioeconomics, to give a sort of, to go away from the Sufi side of things and talk more kind of pragmatically. A lot of it was the fact that in the places that Khan was speaking to, and India at that time, and now Pakistan and Bangladesh, which are very defined by the Barelvi school, it was rural Asia. And so people did not have the privilege, they didn't have the they weren't, depending on where they were in the social strata, for lack of better words, they didn't necessarily have access to, what the scholarly elite had. They didn't have access necessarily to, high-level religious learning. And therefore, their religious literacy wasn't necessarily, a scholarly level on a wide scale. Of course, there were scholars amongst them. But what they did have was a tie to ritual practice, right? Which came to define their Islam and their spirituality. And Khan came and actually said that instead of the building of lots of madrasas, like, for example, the Deobandi school, who had a very top-down institutionalized madrasa system, which again comes to characterize them in the diasporic communities, as we see in Britain, lots of Dar al-Ulums here, right? Khan actually didn't have that. He said, preserve the organic spiritual life of everyone. Everyone deserves a spiritual life. And spiritual life begins with we are Ahl Sunnah, and spiritual life begins with a tie and a close reverence for the Prophet Muhammad. And that is accessible for everyone and necessary for everyone.
Is that maybe what made the Barelvi movement so popular, I'm assuming, in the Indian subcontinent?
Yeah, because it spoke directly to the lived experience of lay people, which obviously makes up the majority.
Okay. Could you tell us a little bit more then about the Barelvi movement and the Barelvi school in the United Kingdom now?
Yeah.
And that history?
Yeah. Well, it's massively important, first and foremost, because, scholars like Bowen, Hamid, for example, have talked about how really in terms of mosque establishment in Britain, the Barelvis were at the forefront. Now, in a kind of on a large scale. Now, there's
and
no
this was
official...
was this after the war, World War II? Is this period?
Slightly later, so it's mid-20th century now, when lots of people are coming from South Asia. But you're right about the war. A lot of it, they were economic migrants. So a lot of them were coming to do the jobs that were needed to be filled in post-war Britain, right, broadly speaking. And so you get huge influx of migrants, as I say, from South Asia who, on the face of it, have come to earn a living, to support their families kind of back home. But what's happened is they have quite quickly realised, and the sociologists call it the myth of return, this idea that we had come here to work and to make our lives in our homelands better.
And then go back eventually.
Exactly. But that return never happened, hence the myth of return. And their lives became embedded on British soil, if you will. And when they were joined by their spouses, which happened a lot in the 80s and the 70s, and then their children were born here, they realised as a community, our lives are here now, and we have to establish ourselves not just economically, but socially and spiritually. And so mosque establishment happened. The Deobandis, for example, on a large scale, began to open madrasas in the madrasa system. And so we see the institutionalization of Islam on British soil. And the Barelvis are important here because, again, not just the opening of the mosques, but what happened within the mosques was very tied to Sufi ritual. So, and these things were socially binding, actually, and they brought people together in one kind of, under one banner of spiritual tradition, if you will. And so, these things aren't just about theology with a small t. These aren't just about tradition. A lot of it is about socioeconomics and identity construction, and the fact that people became, tied to one another socially, because of this tradition that was binding, was socially and spiritually binding, if you will. Because like in the tradition of the Sufis, the Barelvis always, they come together, whether it be for Khatam of Quran, or that is the collective gathering of the recitation of Quran, or whether it be a gathering of Milad or Mawlid or the prophetic birth, or whether it be the distribution of food after a gathering. These are collectivist practices. And this is very key to that kind of Barelvi ritual tradition and how they've become characterized.
Was the Barelvi movement kind of the dominant kind of school of Islam, or the way of practicing Islam in Britain at this period of time, or was it maybe competing with other schools? How popular was it in Britain at this time? I'm not talking about obviously the modern period, but this period.
That period. I would say that yes, certainly it was predominant, in my opinion, because those who adhered to the Deobandi school weren't dominant. They were, absolutely. If we're looking, because from South Asia, where this migration happened, they were the dominant schools. I mean, the kind of, what we refer to now as the Salafi movement, or the Ahl al-Hadith or Wahhabi movement has been known traditionally, that becomes more significant on the British landscape of Islam later, actually. Within this early period, it was kind of the Deobandis and the Barelvis. That polemic still kind of lives today, or at least it's kind of, its inheritance, if you will. But I would say massively it was because a lot of the migrants were coming from Pakistan at this point. And Pakistan is predominantly Barelvi in its thinking, kind of officially and amongst lay people. And a lot of the migration, again, to go back to kind of the sociology of it, if you will, as opposed to the theology, a lot of the migration that came from Pakistan was rural, right? It came from very, very rural areas. So again, the religious literacy wasn't necessarily very high, but the tie to ritual practice was, very, very important to people and significant in their lived experience. And so sort of, and that's kind of why it was so important, why it was so significant. It was actually, I would argue, it was kind of empowering as well for females in that period, interestingly. Because what we see now is kind of, and again, this needs to be backed up with ethnographic kind of data collection, in my opinion, but it's certainly there anecdotally in certain works and through the works of certain scholars, is that a lot of the time the women were not socially mobile, if you will. They didn't work. They were from a kind of traditional kind of gendered setups. And what you see actually was that once a year, a lot of the women who were Barelvis would use their own money to host Milad, for example, in their homes. And they would all come together And it would be a really, really very, very significant period for them, a really significant ritual practice, not just because of the kind of spirituality that it brought organically to them and for them into their homes, but it was a real moment of empowerment for a lot of them, because it was something where the men weren't involved. This is not about the establishment of masajid. This is not about the ritual attendance of the Jum'ah, which, as you are aware, the Hanafis don't emphasize for women. So this was something that was private and in their own homes, but like incredibly empowering. Almost. Exactly. Yeah. And so you have this kind of creation of third spaces through ritual practice that was happening, that the Sufis did and the Barelvis did, particularly early. Right. And they really took their own spirituality into their own home, which again resonates with the whole methodology of Khan himself, who really spoke in his scholarship to lay experience and empowering all people, not just the religious and scholarly elite, but all people with a sense of spirituality, with centralization of the Prophet Muhammad at the very forefront of that. That you can have a rich, organic, spiritual life as long as you are spiritually tied to the Prophet Muhammad. Hence why, and his polemical writing, and people kind of associate him with, deep sectarianism, but actually he called for a Sunni normativity that spoke to the lived experience of lay people. And we see this in a very interesting manifestation through the women, I would argue. Yeah.
I just want to circle back to something that you mentioned about culturally laden expressions of Sufism.
Yeah.
Could you just elaborate on that a little bit more? And how does that relate to Britain in the modern period? How sustainable is that in contemporary Britain?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's really interesting. I mean, it's difficult to tell because, we can't see into the future, but we know that the Barelvi movement in particular, and I kind of use that term as a kind of social scientist because, we're talking really about Sunni normativity, arguably, but the Barelvi movement is defined and it is deeply, deeply rooted in a South Asian experience, right? So lots of the things that come to define and characterize it are very culturally laden expressions. So Naat Khani, for example, is in Urdu, in South Asian languages, be it Punjabi or Pashto or Urdu, right? And even the way that they express, Urdu is kind of, it's very defining of their gatherings, if you will.
It's almost like you need to know Urdu to be able to perhaps participate,
arguably. Although it's always interesting, and I mentioned it earlier as well, kind of this Sufi Arab and non-South Asian, and then the South Asian crossover is always interesting because in Britain you often see kind of, particularly in the late 90s and early 2000s, and even now you see would-be Barelvi scholars and Sufi sheikhs, and then the Arab and non-South Asian scholars all sort of coming together with this shared kind of Sufi sentiment. And that's always an interesting kind of cultural crossover. And you have lots of sort of South Asian youth singing, for example, Arab Inshad and Arabic Qasaid. Again, a very interesting crossover that we see, this melting pot of Britain in even Sufi circles we see. It speaks to the wider kind of community, but or the wider social reality. But to go back, it is. It's deeply characterized by South Asian expressions. I would say predominantly the most significant is language. Now, what happened then, and again, circling back, when young British people were then born, our generation, if you will, they had the very deeply South Asian expressions of Islam from their parents, essentially. But then it didn't necessarily resonate at the level that it did. There was certainly still a reverence for the Sufi Pir of the family, for example, or the Sufi Sheikh, or the leader of the Tariqah. If it was they were in the bay'ah with a particular Sheikh, yes, there would be reverence. There would be appreciation, perhaps, of ritual practice. But I think that we, in, again, sort of the turn of the 21st century, there's a real moment in Britain where British Muslims are saying, oh, this isn't really speaking to me anymore. You know, my Urdu or my Punjabi isn't as strong as my English. It's not very intellectualized. I'd like to have more conversations. Bearing in mind the broader landscape also is the kind of dominant Salafi kind of movement that obviously had been, externally funded in the 80s and the 90s. Lots of graduates of the University of Medina, for example, coming back and preaching. Also political movements with the kind of global political scene, if you will, in Europe and further afield. And so what we see then is the British youth are at a bit of a crossroads now, because perhaps the kind of Salafi or Ahl al-Hadith movement doesn't really speak to them, although it did to many.
Because they are still, maybe the heritage is still
exactly. So they have that kind of Sufi inheritance, yeah.
But yet they don't feel that they could.
Exactly, but there is still some disconnect, and lots of scholars have written about this. It's not a new phenomenon that I'm pointing to, but then you see this influx of kind of the Arabs and the non-South Asians coming. The Sheikh Nuh Hamim Kellers, the Hamza Yusufs, the Abdul Hakim Murads even, you could argue, although he's not a Sufi Sheikh of Tariqa in that sense. And what they do is they bridge this gap quite succinctly. I also think that this was post 9/11, so there's obviously a sort of socio-political element, but, that's for a different podcast episode perhaps. But then you see kind of a shift slightly and a speaking directly to this group of the youth, to this moment in history. And again, a slight move away from the Barelvi tradition in that it's so culturally laden, but then still theologically and sentimentally, I would say, still aligned with the tradition of their parents and their own heritage, if you will. And so sorry, I've gone around the houses slightly there, but just to give you context, if you then ask, because all of those things are important when we're answering the question, what is the future for this community and this tradition? And for Barelviism, I think that it's difficult to say because it is so tied to, in its outward expression at very least, it's very tied to South Asian culture. The way they emote, the way they express, the types of rituals that they do, the slightly less intellectualized way of the neo-traditionalist, for example, that's also been discussed and categorized in the same bracket, if you will. So if it's sustainable, I think the Tariqa model will continue, i.e. the Murid and the Murshid kind of model that is traditional in Sufism. But whether that kind of, and I would make the same argument for the Deobandi school to a certain extent, that whether that very, very can be polemical, kind of deeply sectarian South Asian expression is sustainable for young British Muslims, I think that only time will tell. And I fear that potentially not, unless people or scholars start making more of a kind of top-down effort to keep the tradition alive, but in a way that is kind of accessible and palatable, if you will, for lack of better words, with the young people. And that is happening. There are institutions that are taking to digital spaces, for example, to really, really kind of speak to the experience of young Britons. But whether that's doable on a large scale or going to be done, not Sufis necessarily, but for Barelvis, I think is very difficult to tell. I'll be interesting to find out myself.
Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned this whole like online space, and is there like maybe another shift now that we're in the modern period?
Yeah.
What does Sufism look like in the digital spaces?
Yeah.
And also, we're talking about tariqas and maybe a very traditional way of looking at tasawwuf and Sufism.
Sure.
Is there kind of a different direction that in the modern period when we're talking about things like the digital, the tariqas, that maybe is going in a certain direction?
Yeah.
Maybe could you comment on what that looks like?
Yeah. So, there's two sides to this conversation, really. And it's something that I've written about, and I think it's important that more is done in this conversation. But when we look at, if we move slightly away from the Barelvi school and look at Sufism more broadly, so all encompassing of kind of, from all different places in the world, there is the reality that exists, which is in the postmodern world, in the 21st century, and we're now a quarter of a century into that 21st century. I keep still thinking
it's 2000.
Yeah. But the point is, where we are in history, in this moment in time, the digital space is a lived reality for many people. It's
in fact, most people,
significant.
so much people spend their lives online.
Exactly.
Like it's not, but Sufism is a very interpersonal.
Exactly, right? So there is the reality that is shaped and underpinned by neoliberal ideas and the fact of, we are going out into the world and we're trying to construct our own identities. We're trying to be individuals. We are trying to often make money. We're doing all of those things, part and parcel. And the digital world is a really, really accessible and important way of doing that. And Muslims have been are part and parcel of that reality. So mosques will often have a Instagram handle and a Twitter account and a TikTok and all of that kind of good stuff, right? All the stuff that we love when we're scrolling on our phones when we should be reading a book, perhaps. But I'm old-fashioned, right? Although you will catch me on my phone. But the point is, that is a reality, and it's a helpful reality. It's a helpful reality in many ways. 30 years ago, if you wanted to know when we've just had Eid al-Adha, right? If you wanted to know what time the Eid Salah was in your local masjid, you would have to trot down the street, knock on the door if it was closed, and say, Assalamu alaikum, Imam Saab. Can you tell me when Eid Salah is? And he would say, yeah, we've got one at 8:30 and one at 9:30 and that old chestnut. Nowadays, same chap can go on his phone or ask his son, just check on the internet, on the Instagram page, and it will have it there, and it will say parking, the situation for parking is this, and we'll have tea and cake afterwards, bring your families and all of that. And the convenience of it is fantastic and helpful, and arguably helps and aids people's ritual and spiritual lives, right? And that's great and important and not a reality to be overlooked. But then if you're talking of Sufi tradition and you're talking of the science of Tasawwuf and you're looking at the books like Imam Qushayri's Risala, for example, or Tadkirat al-Awliya, and you're looking at these, pre-Tariqa period, the first centuries after the demise of the Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and how Sufism and spirituality, if you're going to use those words synonymously, existed, was that human interaction, human interfaith were deeply, deeply meaningful, and more than that, were genuinely defining of spiritual realities. To sit in front of someone who was considered a spiritual master,
physically sitting in front of
them. So then it becomes, and as I say, I've written on that kind of very visceral, real, lived experience of the Sufis, and whether if you're taking away the locality and the closeness, the physical proximity, and the gaze that is exchanged between the master and the novice, the murshid and the murid, is now not a gaze at all, but rather an interaction that's in the digital space. Is it truly tasawwuf? Now, my argument is potentially, because if the Sufis were saying anything, it was stop thinking that any reality is your reality. Reality is Allah, right? So it would be ironic if we then go, oh, well,
actually, there is
the Allah of the digital world is the Allah of the analog world, right? And so, yes, absolutely. But there's some will say that ritual, physical attachment, closeness, proximity, right, when it's undermined by digital expression and the philosophies, I would argue, neoliberalism that underpin those, activities, something is lost. It is evolving. It's hybridizing, if you will. And I think that there has to be, like all things and have been said, and we've taken from within Sunni Islam, the pinnacle of tradition is often the middle way, balance, striking this fantastic balance, right? And again, that will come up and come up and come up in every generation. And now we're in a moment in history and time where the balance is, how digital do we let our spiritual lives become? That's the big question for the Sufis, I would argue.
How have like certain tariqas and certain groups, how have they kind of grappled with this question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's an interesting one because the Sufis really have been quite open to digital spaces for a long time. I mean, there was a particular scholar, Purana, who talks about the Naqshbandis, the Haqqanis associated with the Sheikh in Cyprus, who, is very well known. And he was the first kind of Sufi preacher, if you will, to come to Britain. And they had a Sufi chat room. Do you remember chat rooms?
This is
a while
back.
Right, we're going back a while. And they would talk. The Murideen from different places in the world would talk. Right? They would talk about their wird, about their litanies, about the dhikr and adhkar that they would perform, and all of that kind of stuff. Then you had people taking, and it becomes a fiqh issue also. So like people have conversations often about the validity of nikah in the Hanafi madhab. Digitally, if you will, via Zoom or on the telephone and all of that kind of stuff. This also becomes a conversation from a fiqh perspective, because the Sufis, they are concerned with Sharia in terms of the way of the neo-traditionalists that we've talked about in the Baralvis. Is the bay'ah, for example, valid if it's done via Zoom?
Right, of course. Because traditionally the bay'ah is given in person,
in
right?
the hand, male to male, it would be a hand, or for female murideen, it would be,
at least in a close physical proximity.
Well, the sheikh often would hold a sibha, a tasbih, if you will, and the female murid would hold the other side, or a shawl or something. And sometimes there was no physical contact, right? But then there's this strange, and lots of the tariqas, lots of Sufi organizations have taken to these kind of digital expressions. In COVID was a great catalyst, and I say great with a sort of, I don't necessarily mean that in the traditional sense, but this fantastic moment where we see everything's gone online. And so we have murid gatherings, the sheikh is sat in, X country, and the murideen are sort of every place under the sun, and they are joined together in a digital space. And they perform
almost like a digital third space or something.
Exactly. And so we see now this kind of development, and now one could argue, well, it was a necessity. And so when the necessity is now not there, we can go back. But we haven't 100% gone back. People have really run with this in all spaces, not just it's not just Sufi reality. Madrasas are like this. A lot of masajid often digital spaces for different things. Classes of hadith, for example, or Quran tafsir will often be done online. But the argument, I suppose, is, again, the lived reality that the digital world is encroaching upon the analog world at an unprecedented speed and rank, and its reality and significance for younger people is becoming even more, we're not able, even more so, to underestimate it, I should say. But then there's the tradition of closeness, the tradition of locality, the tradition of wherever your sheikh is, you follow him there. And so it is a conversation.
And how do you do that if it's online?
Exactly. And I suppose at a high level, many will argue, I suppose, particularly the Naqshbandis, for example, who were the first to go to that chat room that I mentioned earlier, will argue, this is Allah who gives what we're seeking through the sheikh, right? We seek God. We don't seek people. They're just a means, right? Now, and Allah can give in whatever way he chooses to give. But then I suppose it's a conversation, and people will I don't think we're going to get to an answer on this. We are all, like, much like in sciences of fiqh and tafsir, there are always going to be positions that are going to be, fervently disagreed upon. And I think similarly in the science of tasawwuf, we're going to get this, where there are always going to be some people who say it does not matter. Proximity doesn't matter, locality doesn't matter, digital space, analog space, it doesn't matter, because it's all for God, and God is the one that is going to give. And then there will be people who'll say, no, tradition is tradition. Tradition cannot be changed in that way, so flippantly. But those digital spaces really do have to be taken into consideration in our kind of intellectual conversations about this science and about these communities, because their lived reality is important. Their lived reality really is an expression of their spiritual reality.
And you've written on this, and we can put the link to that in the video as well. I want to circle back to kind of when you broke down the history of Sufism in Britain, kind of divided it into 3 periods. Yeah. Maybe could you talk a little bit about that third period? Yeah. And how does tasawwuf or Sufism shift or change? Yeah. Or maybe it doesn't change in the United Kingdom with this third kind of grouping of Sufism compared to the second, from the Indian subcontinent. Right. How would the Sufism change or shift, and what kind of happens?
Well, I mentioned sort of slightly, we have this kind of cultural shift and this more intellectualized kind of expression, if you will.
What does that look like? Yeah. What would be an intellectualized?
Yeah. So, as I say, this kind of middle period that we're referring to was more defined by ritual practice, right? Very emotional, very devotional, very ritual-centric. Right? Not necessarily high intellectual conversations, not necessarily for people who were religiously literate, if you will, at a high level anyway. And also I want to say that's not to dismiss anyone's experience or create hierarchy in that sense. It's just the way that it was, in that many of us are not scholars, right? But when this kind of late 90s, early 20th century influx of non-South Asian scholars happened, they were really talking in the language of kind of socio-spiritual politics, in a sense. There was a polemical sectarian element here. In the 80s and 90s, the kind of Salafi Ahl al-Hadith movement had gained real significance, with things like Islamic societies at universities and people, talking about kind of the political element, the ummah and the global politics of the Muslims, and how, we need to move. The rhetoric really was, let's move away from just ritual practice and private Islam and look at a public-facing Islam, and a Islam not that can bring us all together, so therefore is not culturally laden, but is just as, and we've heard the tagline, Quran and Sunnah, right? And so we can go into the theology of it, if you will, but this is not significant. What I'm talking about is kind of the social impact of it. And so we see lots of these children of South Asian Brits and the immigrants
who originally would have been perhaps...
I mean, it's most likely that their tradition, they would have come from
like
the
parents
or the urban tradition.
Right, yeah.
Right? And so then you get this rhetoric of kind of a very, very enticing rhetoric, and, and talking in language of Quran, in Arabic. Language was huge. Right? And that you have to,
because it's not Urdu anymore, so the language is...
And it's almost like this is a universal language of Islam, arguably. So let's just go straight to the Quran, and let's go to the Sunnah, and let's go to a pristine, unchanged and uncomplex version of Islam. Again, very enticing in that moment in history. But there were people who, domestically and within families, this caused a lot of discord for, right?
Because the children are kind of maybe shifting away and gravitating towards another way of looking at things. The parents are obviously
discontent with this because it's away from their tradition, particularly when it becomes quite combative and it's, these beers are all, sort of, charlatans, and, conversations like that are happening. And this tariqah system is, a bid'ah, and, it's the esotericism that's often associated, the metaphysics that's associated with Sufism is all kind of nonsense, and we, all of that kind of stuff. We have to think with our brains, Quran, Sunnah, etc.
So this is the kind of the landscape.
That's the landscape, really. And then, again, this is kind of late 90s, post 9/11. You can, again, that's a different conversation, the kind of sociopolitics of it. But then you get an influx of these Sufi preachers who are not South Asian, but
where are they coming
sentimentally. So you get, I mean, a big one is someone like, so the defining characters, if we're looking at people, in that middle section, would probably someone like Bir Maruf, who was in Bradford, Bir Imdad Hussain Birzada, who is the principal and founder of Jami al-Karam, the like very, very large scale seminary, Barelvi Seminary, the biggest in Britain actually, Bir Munawwar Shah in Birmingham. So these are people who are kind of from Pakistan, actually. All three of them are from Pakistan originally, and then who've come over in that sort of middle period that as we're discussing. Then the people who are coming are Sheikh Nur Hamim Keller, for example, who is a convert but now lives in Jordan. You get people like Sheikh Nazim al-Haqqani, who's a Naqshbandi from Cyprus, a Cypriot sheikh. Slightly later, you get Sheikh Muhammad al-Yaqubi, Sheikh Muhammad al-Ninawi, Syrians, both of them.
Right.
And what you see then is they offer almost an antidote to that Quran and Sunnah rhetoric that we're hearing from the Salafis or Ahl al-Hadith, right? And they're saying, no, the Sufi tradition is also from the Quran and Sunnah.
Yeah.
And you get more of an intellectualized English language conversation amongst the youth. They're thinking, this is absolutely fantastic. And again, Bauer and Sadiq, Jeeves, they've all written about this. It's not a new phenomenon that I'm pointing to. But the conversation is, from the dinner table, is Dad now likes this guy because, oh, he does Mawlid. Yeah, we call it Milad, you call it Mawlid now, but that's fine. Yeah, same thing. Oh, you revere the messenger of God the way that we do. Fantastic. What more do we want? Do you see that? And the sentimental attachment is not kind of severed in the way that had been earlier with the kind of Wahhabi or pseudo-Salafi kind of rhetoric that's being espoused. But it's highly intellectualized, it's deeply rooted in, Sunni normativity, with learning, they're starting to study books of tradition, from the Ash'ari school usually, the books of fiqh, going back to those things. And they suddenly feel intellectually empowered as well as spiritually comfortable, if you will, with their already inherited tradition from their parents. And so you see this fantastic meeting and bridge, if you will.
So would we say there's almost like a resurgence maybe, or? I
would say that, so we're in 2025, right? And I would actually argue we're in a fourth stage.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get to that. No, let's go there, because it would be interesting to know what you mean by...
So, 10, 15 years ago, then you get a lot of these Brits that I'm referring to who are going into the bayah with these Sufi sheikhs. So lots of now...
You're talking about the non-South Asian...
Yes, with their non-South Asian kind of Sufis. Right. So I would say that, where 10, 15 years ago in Britain, we have a massive influx of people taking the bayah with these non-South Asian sheikhs, becoming Shadhilis and Darqawis from Syrian and North African tradition predominantly, although, in different places also. Whether that now is sustainable is the same sort of predicament that the migrants found in the early 90s, that their children have a different experience. It's not so conflicting in that one are, South Asian born and one group is, and the next, one generation is South Asian born and the next is British. But even amongst the Sufis now who have children who are older, because the Sufi tradition is also deeply, deeply entrenched in familial ties in a way. My father's sheikh was such and such, and so I've also taken the bayah with this. Yeah. That's quite normal. It's not necessary, but it's very normative and very much what happens in lived experience. And so I suppose now we go into a fourth stage. And this is where digital spaces become really significant, because a lot of people, although sentimentally they might feel an inclination towards Sufism, actually whether they are sitting in Sufi gatherings is far more questionable.
That's
because
interesting.
so much of experience, and this goes way beyond Sufi practitioners, but actually lots of Muslims now in Britain and beyond, their experience is a digital one. If they have a fiqh question, dare I say it, they might ask an AI-generated tool, right? And so we see now that their genuine experience and their genuine religious convictions and literacy is coming from the digital world. And so are now the children of that third group, if you will, or that third wave, are they really going to sit in the same gatherings of their parents, even where 20 years ago or 10 years ago, it really spoke to them in that moment in history? We're now in a whole new one. Yeah. There's actually a PhD written on this called post-Tariqa Sufism.
Right, okay.
I don't think we're there.
Is that a thing? Like, Tariqa Sufism.
We need another podcast episode for that question. It's debated.
Because I can imagine there would be consternation around this, right?
Some traditionalists who practice Sufism will argue that you have to have a guide.
Right, yeah.
You know, there's a famous adage amongst the scholars of Tasawwuf that if you don't have a guide in this world, then shaitan will be your guide in the next. Very strong, again, speaks to the kind of strong emotive nature of this tradition. But it's something to think about. From a normative Sufi perspective, if such a thing exists, you must have a guide and you must have an initiation into the tariqah. Yes. But is the lived reality that, with a world of TikTok shifts and preachers and AI, arguably, whether we like the tradition and we feel close to the tradition or not, and we think that is what we should be, calling for, back to that tradition, the reality is that, 16-year-olds now don't necessarily want to sit in a Sufi gathering, make dhikr for 4 hours like their fathers did or their mothers.
But yet they would maybe still have some kind of an affinity.
They might have an affinity, but they'd much rather spend 4 hours scrolling on TikTok.
Yeah.
TikTok is the word.
Yeah. Okay, good. Thank you, Hafsa. So just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, what do you see as the future of Sufism and also like the Brelvi movement we spoke about in Britain?
I think that they're both at a juncture. I really do. And I think that they've had very significant crossroads moments in the 20th century and into the 21st. And I think that they've dealt with it in a really innovative and interesting way. Just as a social scientist, interesting to watch, right? What the future is, I think that we can't underestimate how significant digital Islam and digital life is to the reality of the lived reality of Muslims in this country. And those are Sufis and non-Sufis, everyone. And I think if we're talking about futures, I really do think that the tariqa tradition is going to, I don't want to say that it's going to lessen, but I think it's certainly going to evolve and it's going to diversify in ways that I'm not even going to try and predict. I don't know what the future holds. But I certainly think that online Sufi practice will continue to rise. And I think that people will move away from deeply rooted sectarianism. And I think we're going to see this hybridization of what were different sects in the past, particularly where it comes to the Brelvi tradition that you mentioned. I don't think that speaks to people anymore. I think that we have more pertinent social and spiritual issues in this country. And I think that young people are going to be at the forefront of therefore hybridizing and evolving this tradition. I don't think it's going anywhere, but I think it's going to look very different.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.